Hi, everybody. I'm Sophia, and today we're going to be talking about counterplans. So, hopefully, at this point, by the time you're watching the video, you've gotten comfortable with what an affirmative is, what a negative is, and especially what a disad is, because that's important, which we'll talk about later. So, first off, what is even a counterplan in the first place? So, a counterplan is just another kind of negative argument. And even though it has the word plan in it, we're still on the negative side. But instead, what we're going to do is we're actually going to make our own plan. So, what's different is typically when you're negative, you're going to be advocating and defending for the status quo. But when you read a counterplan, you're actually going to want to change something in the status quo, similar to how the affirmative is. But keep in mind that you're going to be reading your counterplan and introducing it in the 1NC, just like you would for reading a disadvantage or a critique. And then the other thing you also want to keep in mind is that when you read a counterplan, you always want to read a disadvantage to it. That's super important. So ideally, kind of the goal of the counterplan is that you want to be able to solve for the AF's impacts. So the thing that affirmative says is going to happen if they don't do the plan. So you want to solve for that without causing any other impacts. And that's where your disadvantage comes in and is super important. So let's kind of take a step back and look at the parts of a counterplan and break this down. So the first part of the counterplan is, of course, reading your counterplan text. Just like as if you were affirmative, you're going to read that either the United States federal government, maybe the states, some actor is going to be doing something. And it's going to sound extremely similar to the affirmative's plan text, but keep in mind that yours will be a little bit different. And then we have solvency advocate, which is like how I talked about before with the goal. How does the counterplan solve for the affirmative? And then lastly, you have your net benefit. And this is where the disadvantage is super important. And you want to talk about how the counterplan avoids linking to the disadvantage. So first part, the counterplan text. This part is usually pretty simple, pretty easy. It's just kind of a quick line you get to read in your 1NC shell. And when you read the counterplan, the main difference is that you either have somebody or something different that is enacting this plan, or you just have another way of doing it. But it's still an advocacy that the negative side is defending. So when you read a counterplan, you've got that burden of explaining how you're going to solve the affirmative impact. A good example of this that comes around every year is actually the state's counterplan. And so a lot of affirmatives will start off saying the United States federal government should, but when you read the state's counterplan, you just change the United States federal government to states, and that will be the different actor. All right, so the next part is your solvency advocate. And this is super important. A lot of times it's a big chunk of what your counterplan is about. And you want to explain that the counterplan does a better job at solving for the affirmative's impacts. So maybe the counterplan does it faster. Maybe they save more lives while doing it. They might save more money while doing it. You just always want to make sure that you're including the AF's harms and what they say is going to happen with if you don't do the plan. And so the big thing that you want to differentiate between your counterplan and the affirmative's plan is that you're able to solve for those harms without linking to the disadvantage. And so that is what we call the net benefit. So most of the time, when you're first starting out with debate and you're just learning how to read and answer a counterplan, your disadvantage will almost always serve as your net benefit. So let's break down this word net benefit. Even if you don't know a lot about debate, a net benefit is exactly what it sounds like. So it's a benefit that we have that the affirmative doesn't, and that's what makes it net. So usually I like to ask myself a couple questions, especially because a counterplan and a plan can get a little bit confusing through the debate. So I always ask myself, how does the counterplan avoid linking to the disadvantage? And how does that disadvantage uniquely link to the affirmative? Because even though now both sides are technically reading a plan text, there is something different about the counterplan from the affirmative plan, and that's what you really want to focus on. There's also a lot of different ways you can talk about the net benefit. So one of these ways is you can say that the negatives counterplan has a higher probability of solving the affirmative. So maybe you're more likely to solve it than the affirmative is. And then the other way I also like to think of net benefits is the actual benefit of the counterplan is more. So again, maybe you save more lives than the affirmative. Maybe you save more money than the affirmative. Maybe there's a less chance of nuclear war by going through the counter plan than doing the affirmative. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use this net benefit to your advantage and to really make it a reason for the judge to vote on the counter plan. So let's do an example together. And I think that a food example is fun and it's simple and easy to follow along. So the plan is Sophia, which is me. I'm hungry and I want to go to Chick-fil-A. So let's say if you came up with a counter plan, you would actually say, Sophia's hungry, but instead of going to Chick-fil-A, she should actually go to Chipotle. And so in this case, our net benefit would be the guacamole. So keep in mind, negative going to Chipotle, your net benefit is what you have that the affirmative doesn't. And of course, Chipotle has guacamole and Chick-fil-A does not have guacamole. And so even though both would solve our hunger advantage in this case, only the counter plan offers the ability for me to get guacamole. And then just to kind of end with some strategy, keep in mind that counter plans often can kind of make the debate really muddled and it can get really complicated. So you always want to be very simple, clear, and explicit and concise to your judge. I promise that if you're able to explain the story very clearly and your net benefit and what differentiates your counter plan from the plan, it will definitely be a strong reason for your judge to want to vote on your counter plan. And so another thing that's really important is that you need to convince your judge, and I like to call it the net benefit paradigm. Traditionally, a lot of judges might think, hey, as long as there's nothing wrong with the affirmative, I should still presume to vote affirmative. So it doesn't matter if the counter plan, solves better. There's nothing wrong with voting affirmative. However, when you run the counter plan, it's extremely important to emphasize that the judge should view the debate in terms of who offers the greater benefit. And that would be your disadvantage, which is your net benefit. And that's why running that disadvantage with your counter plan is so important. And I know that if you guys take these strategies and tips into mind, your debates will go great.